The alarm on Emma Richardson's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., 9 minutes before she'd set it to go off at 5:56 a.m. She didn't mind. At 11 years old, Emma had already mastered the art of waking before her alarm, her mind too excited about the day ahead to allow sleep to hold her any longer. She lay in bed for exactly 3 minutes, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling that she'd arranged in the pattern of the Orion constellation, mentally running through her pre-flight checklist. Today wasn't just any day. Today was the day she would finally fly. Emma threw off her covers and padded across her bedroom floor, careful not to step on the model aircraft scattered about like fallen soldiers. There was a 1/48 scale Boeing 747, a smaller Airbus A380, a replica of the Concorde, and her most prized possession, a hand-painted Cessna 172 that her grandfather had given her for her birthday. Posters covered every inch of her walls. The Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, Amelia Earhart standing beside her Lockheed Electra, Neil Armstrong inside the Apollo 11 cockpit. Her desk was organized with military precision, flight logs meticulously filled out, navigation charts color-coded by region, and 3 textbooks about aerodynamics stacked in perfect alignment. At her computer, Emma logged into her flight simulator software and checked the time on her last flight. 14 hours and 32 minutes. She'd flown that mission 17 times now, each attempt pushing her closer to a perfect landing. She knew every elevation change on the approach to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She understood the wind patterns above the Cascade Mountains. She could recite the radio frequencies from memory and understood air traffic control protocols better than some actual pilots. Her flight instructor in the simulator world, a retired commercial airline captain named Frank Miller who monitored the global flight sim community, had once told her, "Emma, you fly like someone twice your age. Your instincts are impeccable." That compliment meant more to Emma than any A+ on a school test. She dressed quickly. Jeans, her favorite blue aviation-themed sweatshirt with the NASA logo, and her well-worn sneakers. Her mother had bought her a beautiful new outfit for the trip, something more presentable, but Emma had politely refused. Comfort was important when you were concentrating on the skis. She grabbed her flight bag, a genuine pilot's flight bag she'd ordered online with money saved from her allowance, and made sure everything was packed. Her flight manual, the same one used by real pilots studying for their commercial aviation licenses. Her navigation tools, her flight log, and a leather-bound journal where she documented her observations about actual aircraft she encountered. Downstairs, her mother was already awake, making coffee and toast. Her father sat at the kitchen table reading the news on his iPad. They'd argued about this trip for weeks. Emma wanted to take a smaller regional jet, something that would bring her closer to understanding basic aircraft handling. Her parents wanted the direct flight to Seattle on a major airline. Compromise came in the form of Flight 447, a Boeing 737, a workhorse commercial aircraft that Emma had studied obsessively. She knew its specifications by heart: maximum altitude of 41,000 feet, cruising speed of 460 knots, a cargo capacity of 52,500 pounds, and seats for up to 189 passengers depending on configuration. "You're up early," her mother observed, sliding a plate of toast in front of her. "I couldn't sleep," Emma admitted, though this wasn't entirely true. She'd slept well, but her excitement had simply overridden her need for additional rest. "I want to review the flight path one more time." Her father smiled. At Emma's age, most girls might be excited about visiting Seattle for shopping or to see the Space Needle. Emma was excited because it meant 7 hours of continuous observation of how a major commercial aircraft operated. She'd already downloaded the expected flight plan, checked weather patterns, and researched the crew manifest. She'd even written down facts about the planes in the gates next to theirs that she'd be able to see from the airport. Her grandfather arrived at 6:30 7:30 a.m. sharp, as he always did. Richard Richardson had retired from his career as a structural engineer 15 years ago, and he'd spent most of that time being his granddaughter's biggest supporter. He pulled up to the house in his old truck, whistling a tune, and bounded up the front steps with the energy of a man half his 78 years. He'd been a pilot himself. Back in the day, nothing commercial, just small planes for recreational flying. But he understood the calling that burned in Emma's chest. "My favorite co-pilot," he said, pulling her into a hug, "ready to go hunting for clouds." "Always," Emma grinned. The drive to Denver International Airport took 40 minutes. Emma spent the entire time staring out the window, her navigation skills tracking their route mentally against the roads they traveled. She pointed out landmarks, the water treatment facility that was always visible from a certain altitude, the radio tower that aviation charts marked with its height above ground level, the pattern of roads that from above would look like a geometric pattern. At the airport, Emma moved through security with practiced efficiency. She'd flown 4 times before, enough to know the process, to understand the layout, to move with purpose rather than wonder. Her grandfather followed in her wake, amused by her focused determination. They walked to their gate, and Emma immediately pulled out her flight bag. She removed her manual and began reviewing the Boeing 737's emergency procedures. A woman sitting nearby with a young child leaned over to her husband and smiled. "That little girl is reading an actual flight manual," she whispered. "That's adorable." Emma didn't mind being underestimated. Children usually were, but she knew something they didn't. That deep knowledge and preparation created opportunity. She'd spent the last 3 years studying every aspect of commercial aviation she could access. She'd memorized aircraft specs, learned to read aeronautical charts, understood fuel calculations, and practiced emergency scenarios countless times in her simulator. When the boarding call finally came, Emma stood up immediately. She straightened her backpack, tucked her flight manual into her carry-on, and turned to her grandfather. "Here we go," she said, her voice steady with quiet confidence. "Here we go," he echoed, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. As they walked down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, Emma could hear the sound of the engines running. That sound, the mechanical roar of turbine power, made her feel alive. It was the sound of possibility, of dreams becoming tangible, of the earth releasing its hold on human beings so they could touch the sky. She stepped into the Boeing 737 and breathed in the distinctive smell of recycled air, synthetic materials, and aviation fuel. Her eyes found the cockpit door immediately. Beyond that door were pilots, professional pilots, trained pilots, men and women who did what Emma dreamed of doing every single day of their lives. She imagined sitting in that left-hand seat, her hands on the yoke, her eyes on the horizon. "Window seat?" her grandfather asked. "Always," Emma replied. As she settled into seat 12C and buckled her seatbelt with deliberate care, Emma had no idea that this particular flight would become the most important day of her life. She had no idea that the captain currently conducting his pre-flight checks beyond that cockpit door was about to become the central figure in an aviation emergency. She had no idea that her 3 years of obsessive study, her countless simulator hours, and her unwavering determination would be needed in ways she could never have imagined. She simply knew that she was finally flying, and she was exactly where she belonged. Captain James Morrison had been flying commercial aircraft for exactly 31 years, 2 months, and 17 days. He knew this because he'd celebrated his retirement date months ago, mentally at least. This would be one of his last flights before hanging up his captain's hat and spending his days on a golf course in Arizona with his wife, Margaret. He'd already bought the golf clubs. They were waiting for him in his garage back home. Morrison was a legend in the commercial aviation community. Pilots younger than him aspired to be like him. Flight attendants requested to work his routes. The FAA had commended him for his safety record. In 20,000 flight hours, He'd never had a serious incident. He'd landed planes in thunderstorms, in crosswinds that made passengers grip their armrests in terror, in conditions that made younger pilots nervous. He was the embodiment of calm competence. Flight 447 had departed Denver International Airport at 8:47 a.m. on a perfectly clear Tuesday morning. The weather was ideal. The sky was crystalline blue. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800, one of the most reliable commercial aircraft in the world. Morrison had logged over 300 hours in this exact model. Everything about this flight was routine, ordinary, predictable. 41 minutes into the flight, at 30,000 feet above the mountains of central Oregon, Captain Morrison was conducting his standard mid-flight checks. First Officer David Chen sat in the right-hand seat, monitoring instruments and maintaining radio contact with air traffic control. Both men were relaxed. The autopilot was engaged. The aircraft was performing flawlessly. Somewhere around the 8-minute mark of the flight, a Boeing 747 had passed them going in the opposite direction, and Morrison had watched it disappear into the distance with the casual appreciation of one professional acknowledging another. Everything changed at 9:28 a.m. Morrison felt it first as a tightness in his chest, not pain exactly but pressure, like someone had wrapped a rubber band around his heart and was slowly squeezing. He'd experienced indigestion before, and he assumed that's what this was. He reached for the coffee in his cup holder and took a sip. The coffee was cold. He made a mental note to ask for fresh coffee in a few minutes. The pressure intensified. Now it became pain, sharp, radiating pain that shot from his chest down his left arm. Morrison's face went pale. His hands, which had been resting on the yoke with practiced ease, suddenly felt numb. A tingling sensation spread across his fingers. His vision blurred slightly. Something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. I need a moment," Morrison said to Chen, his voice strained in a way it had never been before. Chen glanced over, concerned. "Captain, everything okay?" Morrison tried to respond, but words wouldn't come. The pain was overwhelming now, a crushing sensation that felt like an elephant sitting on his chest. He tried to stand up, thinking maybe he needed to move, maybe that would help. His legs didn't respond the way they should. They felt weak, unreliable. "Get me medical," he gasped. Chen's eyes went wide. He immediately recognized the signs: chest pain, pale complexion, difficulty speaking. He'd done a medical emergency training course just 6 months ago. "Captain, sit back down," Chen commanded, his training kicking in. "I've got you." But Morrison was already leaning forward, his body convulsing slightly. His hand reached out toward the controls, then fell away. His eyes rolled back and his entire body went limp. He slumped sideways in his seat, his head striking the side panel with a sickening thud. Blood began to drip from a small laceration on his forehead. First Officer David Chen had been flying for 8 years. He was a competent pilot, well-trained and capable, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. The captain wasn't just another passenger. The captain was the authority, the expert, the person who handled emergencies. And now the captain was unconscious in the seat next to him, possibly dying. Chen's hands immediately gripped the yoke. He pushed all the training he'd ever received to the forefront of his mind. Step 1. Maintain aircraft control. The plane was still flying. The autopilot was still engaged. The immediate threat to flight safety was controlled. Step 2. Declare an emergency. Chen leaned toward the radio with trembling fingers and pressed the transmit button. His voice shook as he spoke, though he struggled to maintain professional clarity. "Denver Center, this is Flight 447. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Our captain is unresponsive. I am declaring a medical emergency, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." Static then. Flight 447 understood. Medical emergency declared. Stand by for vectors. In the cabin behind the locked cockpit door, that transmission went out over the cabin speaker system. The words "medical emergency" had the effect of throwing a switch that turned a pleasant flight into a nightmare. Passengers gasped. A woman in seat 8A grabbed her husband's arm. A teenager in seat 14D immediately pulled out his phone to text goodbye to his mother. A businessman in first class stood up instinctively, then sat back down, realizing there was nowhere to go. The flight attendant sprang into action. The head flight attendant, Margaret Chen, no relation to the first officer, had been working for a major airline for 23 years. She'd seen medical emergencies before, people having panic attacks, diabetics with low blood sugar, someone having a severe allergic reaction. But a medical emergency in the cockpit, that was different. That was terrifying. Margaret rushed to the cockpit door. "First Officer Chen, what's happening?" "Get me the AED," Chen called back, referring to the automated external defibrillator. "Captain Morrison is unconscious. Possible cardiac event. I need medical personnel standing by." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She'd served coffee to Captain Morrison that morning. He'd asked her about her grandchildren. He'd seemed fine, more than fine. He'd seemed like he always did, calm, professional, in complete control. Behind her, the cabin was descending into controlled panic. Not the screaming, chaotic panic of a disaster movie, but something worse. The muted, terrified silence of people realizing they might be about to die. A retired nurse in seat 22C approached the cockpit area and offered to help. Margaret gratefully directed her to the cabin where Morrison lay slumped against the cockpit door, blood still trickling down his temple. The nurse began assessing him, checking for a pulse, positioning him in the recovery position. Meanwhile, Chen was flying the aircraft alone, communicating with Denver Air Traffic Control, coordinating with the cabin crew, and trying not to panic. His eyes constantly scanned the instruments, altitude holding steady at 30,000 feet, fuel consumption normal, all systems functioning. The aircraft was fine. It was the human element that was failing. "Flight 447, this is Denver Center," the radio crackled. "We're vectoring you to Seattle-Tacoma International. Distance to Seattle 187 miles. Flight time approximately 42 minutes. Medical personnel will be standing by upon landing. Do you require an air emergency diversion to a closer airport?" Chen did the math in his head. 42 minutes felt like a lifetime, but there was a smaller airport closer to their position. Going there would reduce flight time but might also mean landing at an airport with less capable medical facilities. He made a decision. Negative, Denver Center. We'll continue to Seattle-Tacoma. It's the largest medical facility in the region. Flight 447, understood. Descend and maintain 25,000 feet. Expect Seattle approach on 119.5. Chen adjusted the autopilot. The aircraft began its descent. In the cabin, passengers held their breath. They passed over the Cascade Mountains, over forests and lakes, with no idea that their survival depended entirely on a young first officer who'd never flown a major commercial aircraft without a captain supervising him. And 42 minutes felt impossibly long. The aircraft was descending through 28,000 feet when panic truly took hold of Flight 447. It wasn't the explosive, chaotic panic of disaster movies. It was something more insidious, a collective realization that something catastrophically wrong had happened, and nobody knew what to do about it. A woman in seat 6B was crying softly into her hands. Her husband rubbed her back helplessly. A man in seat 15A was texting frantically, trying to send what might be final messages to his family. A group of teenage girls who'd been laughing and joking less than an hour ago now sat in terrified silence, hands clasped together. Near the window, a mother held her 3-year-old daughter, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. In seat 12C, Emma Richardson sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but her mind remarkably clear. While other passengers spiraled into fear, her training was taking over. She'd practiced emergency scenarios hundreds of times. She knew the protocols. She understood what was happening. Her grandfather, Richard Richardson, sat beside her in seat 12A, his weathered hand gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He was terrified, not for himself, but for his granddaughter. He knew Emma well enough to recognize the careful composure in her face, the focused intensity in her eyes. She was analyzing, calculating, preparing. "Grandpa," Emma whispered, leaning toward him so only he could hear over the ambient noise of the frightened passengers and the constant hum of the aircraft. "Something happened in the cockpit. The captain is incapacitated." Richard's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "The descent profile," Emma said quietly, her eyes fixed on the window. "It's not standard, and the first officer declared a medical emergency. The angle of descent, the rate of descent, he's not familiar with this aircraft's handling characteristics. He's compensating." Richard stared at his granddaughter in amazement. While everyone around them was falling apart, Emma was conducting an aeronautical analysis. "What does that mean?" he asked carefully. "It means he's flying solo, and he's nervous," Emma responded. Her voice was steady, but Richard could see her hands trembling slightly. "If the captain had a medical event, the first officer is alone in the cockpit. He's probably never flown a 737 solo before." 2 rows back, Margaret Chen, the head flight attendant, was moving through the cabin, trying to maintain order, trying to project calm while internally screaming. She was answering questions she didn't have answers to. "Yes, we're aware of the situation." "No, I don't have more information right now. Medical personnel will be standing by." A businessman in seat 11C grabbed her arm as she passed. "What's happening? Is this plane going to crash?" "Sir, please remain calm," Margaret said, using every ounce of her training to keep her voice steady. "The captain is receiving medical attention. First Officer Chen is an excellent pilot. We will land safely in Seattle." She said it with confidence she absolutely did not feel. That's when she heard it, a voice cutting through the ambient panic with crystalline clarity and authority. "The autopilot is maintaining altitude," a young voice said. Margaret stopped dead in her tracks. She turned to look. In seat 12C, a girl, couldn't be more than 12 years old, was explaining something to her grandfather with the precision of a flight instructor. "That buys time. The descent sequence is already programmed into the flight management system. As long as First Officer Chen follows the descent profile, the aircraft is stable." Margaret's feet moved before her brain fully processed what was happening. She found herself standing in the aisle next to seat 12C, staring at this small girl with intelligent eyes and a level of aviation knowledge that shouldn't exist in someone her size. "What's your name?" Margaret asked. "Emma Richardson," the girl replied, looking up at Margaret with surprising composure. "My grandfather is Richard Richardson. I'm sorry if I'm talking too loud. I was just explaining to my grandfather what I think is happening." "No, no," Margaret said quickly. "You're not in trouble. Emma, can I ask you something?" Emma nodded, waiting. "You seem to understand what's happening with this aircraft," Margaret continued carefully. "How do you know so much about this?" Emma hesitated for just a moment, then decided honesty was the best approach. "I study aviation. I have over 800 hours on flight simulators. I've trained on Boeing 737s extensively. I've memorized all the emergency procedures and system configurations." Margaret felt something shift inside her. This was either the most remarkable coincidence of her career, or it was Providence stepping in. She glanced at Richard, whose face showed a mixture of pride and deep concern. "Mr. Richardson," Margaret said carefully, "does Emma have experience with commercial aircraft operations?" "She's been obsessed with aviation her entire life," Richard said, his voice wavering slightly. "But she's only 11 years old. She's never actually flown anything except in simulators." Margaret made a decision that would be scrutinized by the FAA, debated in aviation circles for years to come, and ultimately celebrated as one of the most unconventional yet correct decisions in aviation history. But in that moment, standing in a cabin full of frightened people, with a first officer alone in the cockpit managing a medical emergency, she simply recognized that she had access to a resource that might help. "Emma," Margaret said, crouching slightly so she was eye level with the girl, "I'm going to ask you something that might sound very strange, but I need you to understand that no matter what you say, you won't be in any trouble. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma said. "If you were in the cockpit right now, observing what's happening, do you think you could help?" Emma's eyes widened. Richard reached over and gripped his granddaughter's shoulder, both a warning and an encouragement. Emma took a long moment before answering. She thought about her years of study, her simulator flights, her understanding of the aircraft. But more than that, she thought about what was really being asked. Margaret wasn't asking if Emma could pilot the aircraft. She was asking if Emma could help, and there was a difference. "I could monitor systems," Emma said carefully. "I could help with calculations. I could be another set of eyes and hands, but I'm not a pilot. I can't land the aircraft." "I know," Margaret said gently. "But right now, First Officer Chen is flying alone, and he probably needs all the help he can get." Richard looked at his granddaughter. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment when Emma's years of preparation would be tested. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else: determination. "If you want to do this," Richard said quietly, "I believe in you." Emma turned to Margaret. "When do you need me?" Margaret stood up. "Right now, come with me." As Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, the passengers around her watched in confusion. Who was this girl? Where was she going? What was happening? Emma walked down the aisle beside Margaret, her small frame looking impossibly fragile in the middle of a crisis that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. But her posture was straight. Her chin was up, and her mind was already running through emergency checklists and system configurations. Behind her, Richard Richardson whispered a prayer, not for safety, but for his granddaughter's courage. As they approached the cockpit door, Emma could hear First Officer Chen's voice on the radio, coordinating with Seattle Approach Control. She could hear the stress underneath his professional words. She could hear the barely contained panic of a man who realized he was in charge of 189 lives and had never done this before. Margaret pressed the intercom to the cockpit. "First Officer Chen, we have a situation. I have someone here who might be able to help you." There was a pause, then, "Margaret, I don't have time for." "She has 800 hours on 737 simulators," Margaret interrupted. "She knows the systems. She's 11 years old and she's here to help." Another pause, then finally a voice that sounded like it might break, "Send her in." The cockpit door opened, and Emma Richardson stepped through the threshold into her destiny. The cockpit door closed behind Emma with a soft hiss of pressurization. She stood for a moment in the narrow space, her eyes adjusting to the different lighting. The cockpit was smaller than she'd imagined, not small in an uncomfortable way, but intimate. Every square inch was packed with purpose. Every button, switch, and gauge had a function. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. First Officer David Chen didn't immediately look at her. He was focused on the instruments, his eyes constantly moving from one gauge to another in the practice pattern of a pilot scanning his flight. But Emma could see his hands trembling slightly on the yoke. She could see the tension in his shoulders. She could see a man at the absolute edge of his training and experience. "Sit down," Chen said, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone giving orders because giving orders was the only thing that felt like it was still under his control. Emma moved toward the right-hand seat, the co-pilot's seat, but she hesitated. That was Captain Morrison's seat, except it wasn't anymore. The captain was unconscious in the cabin behind her, fighting for his life. Emma climbed into the co-pilot's seat and carefully fastened the 5-point harness. For a long moment, Chen still didn't look at her. He was speaking quietly to Seattle Air Traffic Control. Seattle approach, Flight 447, maintaining 24,000 feet. The medical situation remains stable. We are continuing to Seattle-Tacoma as planned. The response was immediate. Flight 447, understood. You are cleared for further descent to 20,000 feet at your discretion. Chen adjusted the altitude selector on the autopilot, and the aircraft nosed slightly downward. Only then did he turn to look at the girl sitting in the co-pilot's seat. David Chen was 34 years old. He'd been flying since he was 19. He'd logged over 3,000 flight hours. He'd trained extensively on this aircraft, and he'd never, in all his life, expected to find himself in a cockpit with a 12-year-old child during a medical emergency. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Emma Richardson," she replied. "I'm 11, actually not 12, and I want to be very clear about something. I'm not here to pilot this aircraft. I know my limitations. I have 800 hours on flight simulators, but that's not the same as real flying. I understand the difference between theory and practice." Chen stared at her for a moment, then did something he didn't expect to do. He laughed, a short, almost hysterical laugh that broke some of the tension. "At least you're aware of your limitations. That's more than some real pilots I know." "I'm here to be another set of eyes and hands," Emma continued. Her voice was surprisingly steady. "I can monitor systems. I can help with calculations. I can read instruments and relay information. I've trained for emergency procedures in the simulator. I can help, but I need you to understand that you're still flying this plane. You're the captain now, whether you feel ready or not." Chen turned back to his instruments, processing what she'd said. He was the captain now. He hadn't thought of it in those terms, but it was true. Captain Morrison was incapacitated. That made Chen the pilot in command. The responsibility, the full, crushing weight of it, settled on his shoulders even more heavily. "Have you ever actually flown real aircraft?" he asked. "No," Emma admitted, "but I've studied every system on this aircraft. I know where every switch is. I know what every instrument measures. I know the emergency procedures backward and forward." "Seattle approach, Flight 447, Chen transmitted again. "Begin descent to 15,000 feet. He trimmed the aircraft and the nose angled down slightly more. Emma watched his movements with intense focus. This wasn't a simulator. The aircraft responding to his inputs was made of aluminum and carrying real people. The atmosphere outside the window was real. The danger was real. "Tell me about the current situation," Emma said, falling into the analytical mode that had sustained her through hundreds of simulator flights. "Aircraft status, fuel reserves, distance to Seattle, weather conditions." Chen hesitated only briefly, then began to brief her as if she were an actual co-pilot. And as he spoke, something shifted in the cockpit. Her questions showed understanding. Her observations were intelligent. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't pretending to know things she didn't. She was being methodical and precise. "Fuel status?" Emma asked. 70% remaining, Chen replied. "We departed with full tanks. Flight time to Seattle is approximately 38 minutes at current descent rate and fuel burn." "That gives us a safe margin," Emma calculated. "We have reserves for diversion or holding if necessary." She reached forward and tapped the fuel quantity indicator. "This reads slightly low on the right tank. Is that normal?" Chen's eyes widened slightly. "Good catch. The right engine uses fuel slightly faster, but it's within normal parameters." Emma nodded, filing that information away. She turned her attention to the navigation display. "We're on course for the standard descent profile to Seattle. Which runway will we be using?" "They haven't assigned one yet," Chen said. "That'll happen as we get closer." "We should anticipate the wind conditions," Emma suggested, pointing to the weather radar display. "There's a low-pressure system moving in from the coast. By the time we land, there might be crosswind issues. We should be ready to request runway 16 left if it has better wind alignment." Chen looked at this small girl in the right-hand seat who was calmly analyzing weather patterns and runways, and he felt something he desperately needed: hope. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who understood, someone who could think through problems with him. "Listen," he said quietly, "I need to be honest with you. I've never flown a 737 solo before. Captain Morrison was supervising. I was the second pilot. This is—" he paused, searching for words. "This is the most scared I've ever been." Emma turned to look at him. Her young face was serious. "That's okay. Fear means you understand the responsibility. What's important is that you know how to fly this aircraft. You've been trained. You have the knowledge. And now you have help." "What if I make a mistake?" Chen asked, voicing the fear that had been haunting him since Morrison collapsed. "Then we'll catch it," Emma said simply. "That's what a co-pilot does. We watch each other. We verify each other's calculations. We're the safety net. Captain Morrison would have you for this. I will too." Chen gripped the yoke more loosely than he had before. The pressure in his chest eased slightly. He wasn't just a first officer anymore. He was the captain, and this 11-year-old girl had just become his most valuable crew member. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath. "Let's fly this aircraft home." From the back, Margaret appeared at the cockpit door with a bottle of water. "Can I get anyone anything?" "Water would be good," Chen said. Then he glanced at Emma. "You." "Water is fine," Emma replied. "And Margaret, thank you for bringing me up here." Margaret nodded, understanding the weight of what she'd done. Then she closed the door again, leaving Emma and Chen alone in their small cockpit in the sky. Emma turned her attention back to the instruments. Her hands rested gently on the secondary controls, not gripping them, just touching them lightly, feeling the aircraft's response through her fingertips. She was flying now, not alone, not commanding, but flying nonetheless. And in that cockpit, 30,000 feet above the earth, something remarkable was happening. An inexperienced pilot and an untrained but brilliant girl were becoming a team. The descent from 30,000 feet to landing altitude is a carefully choreographed sequence of descent rates, speed reductions, and system configurations. For an experienced captain and a well-trained first officer, it's routine. For David Chen flying solo and an 11-year-old girl monitoring systems, it was a dance on the edge of disaster, one where a single misstep could cascade into catastrophe. "Descent checklist," Chen called out, his voice the steady tone of command that he'd learned from 34 years of flying. Emma immediately knew what he meant. She pulled up the descent checklist in her memory, the same checklist she'd executed hundreds of times in the simulator. She began reading through it with professional precision. Descent procedure briefing complete. Flight controls normal. Flight instruments normal. Pressurization normal. Flight attendant notification complete. Electronic flight bag loaded with approach charts. Anti-ice and rain protection as required. Autopilot engaged. Landing gear up. Flaps 0 degrees. Chen verified each item. Correct. Activate the descent profile. Emma input the command into the flight management system. The aircraft responded immediately, the nose angling downward at the perfect descent rate. The altimeter began unwinding. 28,000 feet, 27,500 feet, 27,000 feet. Seattle approach, flight 447, Chen transmitted, requesting descent to 20,000 feet. The response came immediately. Flight 447, cleared to descend to 20,000 feet. QNH 29.92. QNH, the barometric pressure setting that would be used for the approach. Emma immediately noted the number and verified it against what was displayed on the altimeter. Altimeter set and verified, she confirmed. Chen was flying smoothly now, his initial panic giving way to the muscle memory of thousands of hours of training. But his hands still showed tension on the yoke. He was hyper-aware that every input he made was being felt by 189 people behind him. "Fuel burn?" he asked Emma. She scanned the fuel management display, watching the red numbers that indicated how much fuel each engine was consuming. Right engine burning slightly faster than left. Total consumption is nominal for descent rate. Current fuel estimate, 4,500 pounds remaining on arrival at Seattle. That's well above minimum reserves. "Good," Chen said, relaxing fractionally. He could make it to Seattle. Even with the medical emergency, even flying alone, he could make it. 30 minutes into the descent, the weather began to change. The clear skies they'd left behind in Denver had been replaced by clouds. As they descended through 15,000 feet, the aircraft entered the cloud layer. The window ahead showed nothing but gray. The altimeter and attitude indicator became their only reference to the outside world. "Instrument approach conditions," Emma observed calmly. "I've got it," Chen replied, his eyes fixed on the instruments. Flying blind by reference to instruments alone was where experience really showed. Emma couldn't help here. This was pure flying, pure instrument interpretation and control. But then something changed on one of the displays. "First Officer Chen," Emma said quietly, her young voice cutting through the white noise of the engines. "The vertical speed indicator is showing drift. You're descending 0.5 degrees faster than the flight plan indicates." Chen's hands adjusted immediately, pulling back slightly on the yoke. The vertical speed indicator stabilized. He glanced at Emma with something like awe. She'd noticed something he was still learning to feel in his bones. "Good eye," he said. "It's a machine," Emma replied. "It doesn't get tired, it doesn't miss details." As they descended through 10,000 feet, the first glimpse of the terrain below emerged through gaps in the clouds. Mountains, forests, the sprawl of civilization in the distance. "Seattle approach, Flight 447 at 10,000 feet, Chen transmitted. "Request vectors to final approach for runway 16 left." There was a pause. "Flight 447, stand by. We're moving you to the priority approach vector. Expect vectors to intercept the instrument landing system for 16 left in approximately 8 minutes. Continue descent to 5,000 feet at your discretion." Emma was already calculating. "At our current descent rate and speed, we'll reach 5,000 feet in exactly 6 minutes and 40 seconds. That gives us a 1-minute 20-second buffer before reaching the altitude restriction." "Perfect," Chen said. Behind them in the cabin, Margaret was working with the retired nurse to manage Captain Morrison. His vital signs had stabilized somewhat, but he remained unconscious. Outside the cockpit, 187 passengers held their breath, aware that something critical was happening in the front of the aircraft, but unsure exactly what. At 8,000 feet, the clouds began to break apart. The landscape below became clearer. Emma could see the waters of Puget Sound, the islands scattered across it, the urban sprawl of the Seattle metropolitan area. It was beautiful, even in a moment of crisis. She couldn't help but appreciate the view. 8 minutes to landing," she said, watching the distance-to-destination counter on the navigation display. "How are you holding up?" Chen asked, glancing at Emma briefly. "My heart is pounding," Emma admitted, "but my hands are steady. How about you?" "Same," Chen said. "But right now I'm focused. Right now I'm a pilot flying an aircraft. Nothing else matters." They continued their descent. At 5,000 feet, the visibility improved dramatically. They could see the airport now, Seattle-Tacoma International, a sprawling complex of runways and taxiways. "Flight 447, descend to 3,000 feet, Seattle approach instructed. Turn left heading 240 for approach." Chen banked the aircraft and Emma watched the heading indicator rotate. This was it. They were on approach now. The final sequence was beginning. Landing checklist, Chen called. Emma responded with the same precision she'd shown throughout the flight. Landing gear status, flap configuration, fuel quantity, emergency equipment, passenger briefings, weight and balance. Each item was verified. All items completed, Emma confirmed. Approach is going to vector us for the instrument landing system, Chen explained, more to himself than to Emma, but she appreciated the narration. Once we intercept the glide slope, I'll transition to autopilot approach mode. The aircraft will guide us down to 200 feet. Then we have to see the runway for visual landing. What if we don't see it? Emma asked. We'll execute a go-around and try again, Chen said, but his voice suggested that wasn't really an option they had. Captain Morrison was critical. The longer they stayed in the air, the more danger he was in. The radio crackled. Flight 447, you are cleared for approach to runway 16 left. Intercept the glide slope and maintain localizer until visual contact with the runway. Flight 447, copy, Chen transmitted. Emma watched the navigation display. A diamond-shaped symbol began converging on a horizontal line, the localizer and glide slope of the instrument landing system. Chen reduced power slightly, and the aircraft began to descend at the perfect angle. Glide slope captured, Emma announced, watching the crosshairs on the attitude indicator align perfectly. Autopilot approach mode engaged, Chen confirmed, pressing the button that would let the aircraft fly itself down the glide slope. They were at 2,000 feet now. Emma could see the runway ahead, but it was still too far away to make out clearly. Around them, the landscape was becoming increasingly detailed. She could see individual buildings, cars on the roads, the geometry of streets. 2 minutes to landing, Emma said, watching the distance counter. Chen's hands rested lightly on the yoke, ready to take control if something went wrong. His eyes constantly monitored the instruments and the view ahead. "Come on, baby," he whispered to the aircraft, "just a little bit further." And the Boeing 737, carrying 189 souls and 2 unlikely pilots, one with 3 decades of experience, one with none, descended through the sky toward home. At 5,000 feet, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport spread out beneath them like a blueprint drawn on the earth. The main runways were clearly visible now, parallel concrete strips that stretched for nearly 10,000 feet each, designed to catch aircraft traveling at 150 miles per hour. For Emma, staring down at them, they looked both impossibly large and impossibly small. Seattle approach, Flight 447 descending through 4,500 feet, Chen transmitted, his voice steady but with an edge of tension that only another pilot would notice. The controller's response was immediate. Flight 447, you are number 1 for approach. Continue descent to 2,000 feet and maintain the glide slope. Number 1 for approach meant they were the priority. Every other aircraft in the area was holding, circling, waiting. The entire airport was coordinating around this one aircraft, this one pilot, and this one girl in the cockpit. The weight of that realization pressed down on Emma like physical force. In the cabin behind them, Margaret was working with the retired nurse and a paramedic who'd been a passenger, a man named Thomas who'd revealed his profession and immediately volunteered to help with Captain Morrison. They'd gotten an IV line established. Morrison's vital signs had stabilized, but he remained unconscious, his condition critical and uncertain. Thomas looked at Margaret with grave eyes. "He needs a hospital. This man needs surgery or medication within the hour," or he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Margaret glanced toward the locked cockpit door. Everything now depended on what was happening behind that door. Everything depended on a first officer and a child. In the cockpit, Chen was acutely aware of the time pressure. Every minute they stayed in the air, Captain Morrison's condition deteriorated further. But rushing the approach was how accidents happened. He forced himself to slow down mentally, to think through each step carefully. Descent rate verification, he called to Emma. She scanned the vertical speed indicator. 750 feet per minute. That's within limits for approach. You're stable. Engine parameters, he asked. Emma checked each engine's performance readout. Both engines nominal. Temperature, pressure, fuel flow all within limits. No warnings or cautions active. It was the kind of briefing a real co-pilot would give, and it helped. It grounded Chen in procedure, in process, in the thousands of flights that had been completed successfully using these exact same methods. They passed through 3,000 feet. The city spread out around them in all directions now. Emma could see individual cars on the roads, people on the ground who had no idea that an 11-year-old girl was helping to land their aircraft. She felt the enormity of that responsibility settle into her bones. Weather check, Chen requested. Emma read the latest automated weather observation. Surface wind 180 degrees, 12 knots, gusting to 18 knots. Visibility 8 miles. Scattered clouds at 2,000 feet. Chen processed that information. The wind was relatively calm, not ideal but manageable. Visibility was good. The cloud layer was above their landing altitude. They would have visual reference for the landing. Those were good signs. We're in a good position, Chen said, as much to himself as to Emma. Everything is lining up. What happens after we land? Emma asked, looking down at the runway that was becoming clearer by the second. Paramedics are standing by, Chen said. They'll board as soon as the wheels are down. Captain Morrison will be taken directly to Harborview Medical Center, their trauma center, the best in the region. So we just have to get him on the ground, Emma said. Just, Chen echoed, with a slight laugh that had an edge of hysteria to it. Just land a Boeing 737 with 189 people on board. Just execute a perfect landing despite the fact that I've never done it without a supervising captain. Just save a man's life. You can do this, Emma said quietly. Her voice had a certainty in it that Chen didn't feel but desperately wanted to believe. I've watched you fly, you're good, you're careful, you're methodical. Those are the qualities that matter. They were at 2,500 feet now. The runway was directly ahead, perfectly aligned. The glide slope indicator on the instrument panel showed they were precisely centered on the descent path, not too high, not too low. Approach checklist, Chen called. Emma went through it. Landing gear status, flap setting, anti-ice, emergency equipment, fuel quantity, weight, and balance. Each item was verified, checked, confirmed. The checklist was more than just a list of items to verify. It was a ritual, a framework that kept chaos at bay. It was the difference between flying and falling. All items complete, Emma confirmed. Thank you, Chen said, and Emma understood that he meant something deeper than gratitude for a checklist read. He meant thank you for being here, for helping, for not panicking, for being exactly what he needed. They passed through 2,000 feet. The runway was rushing toward them now, the perspective changing rapidly. Emma's hands were gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Chen's hands, by contrast, were relaxed on the yoke, a contradiction that somehow made sense. His hands were loose because his mind was absolutely focused. He couldn't afford tension in his muscles. Landing gear down and locked, Emma announced, watching the indicator lights turn green. Autopilot will disengage at 500 feet, Chen said. After that, it's all manual. I'll be flying the aircraft visually. I can see the runway markings, Emma said. The white numbers marking the runway's designation were visible now. The taxiway lights created geometric patterns below. Runway 16 left, 9,000 feet long. Emma narrated the facts as they descended. Elevation 433 feet above sea level. 1,000 feet, Chen said, calling out their altitude in the traditional way. His voice was calm now. He was in the zone, that place where a pilot stops thinking about flying and simply becomes one with the aircraft. 500 feet, Emma called out. The autopilot disengaged with a soft chime. From this point forward, Chen was flying manually. The runway filled the windscreen. Emma could see the perspective changing, the angle becoming shallower as Chen leveled the aircraft off for landing. "Flare," Chen said quietly, moving the control yoke back slightly. The nose of the aircraft lifted and their descent rate slowed. They weren't descending as quickly anymore. They were gliding, settling, preparing to touch down. "Landing lights coming on," Emma said, but she was really just narrating what she saw happening. Chen was beyond the point of needing instructions. He was pure pilot now. In the cabin, Margaret gripped the armrest of a jump seat. Thomas kept his hand on Captain Morrison's forehead, monitoring his condition. Every passenger held their breath. At 50 feet above the ground, Chen could see the texture of the runway. The lights, the markings, everything was real now. Everything was about to happen. 40 feet, Emma whispered, not needing to speak but unable to remain silent. Chen made a tiny adjustment to the yoke, just enough, just right. 30 feet. The landing lights illuminated the runway surface, showing exactly where they would touch down. 20 feet. The aircraft was floating now, descending at a rate of barely 2 feet per second. 10 feet, 5 feet. And then the main landing gear touched down first. There was a subtle bump, not violent, not jarring, but definite. The sound of rubber on concrete, 150 tons of aircraft settling onto solid earth. For David Chen, flying a commercial aircraft for the first time without supervision, it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. "Main gear touchdown," Emma announced, her voice wavering slightly with emotion. The nose wheel came down a fraction of a second later, and suddenly they were fully grounded. No longer flying, no longer suspended between earth and sky. The aircraft was down. "Reversers," Chen called out, immediately deploying the thrust reversers on both engines. The high-pitched whine of the engines reversing their direction of thrust filled the cockpit. Instead of pushing the aircraft forward, the engines now pulled against their momentum, helping to slow the 737 down. Emma reached forward and activated the speed brake system. Panels on the wings extended upward, creating aerodynamic drag. Every system designed to slow an aircraft was now engaged. "Spoilers deployed," Emma confirmed. "Speed brake active." The runway stretched ahead of them, appearing to rush past at an impossible speed. But the aircraft was decelerating rapidly now. The airspeed indicator unwound. 120 knots, 110 knots, 100 knots. Chen applied the wheel brakes, not slamming them but firm, decisive pressure on the pedals. The aircraft groaned as friction took hold of the wheels. Emma could feel it through her seat, through the controls, through every fiber of her being. 80 knots, Emma called out. 60 knots. The runway was becoming less of a blur and more of a distinct surface now. Chen could see the taxiway markings, the exit ramps. 40 knots. The aircraft was slowing dramatically now. The reversers screamed as they continued to push backward against their motion. 20 knots. Emma's hands gripped her armrests. This was it. This was the final moment. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. "Reverse thrust idle," Chen called, reducing the reversers to normal position. The aircraft was moving slowly now, slow enough that the reversers could be disengaged without creating dangerous asymmetrical forces. The aircraft continued to slow. 10 knots. And then the Boeing 737 came to a complete stop. For a moment there was absolute silence in the cockpit, just the hum of the engines at idle, just the sound of the auxiliary power unit, just the sound of breathing. Then Chen released the control yoke and leaned back in his seat. His entire body suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The adrenaline that had been carrying him through the emergency drained away, leaving him exhausted, shaken, and alive. Emma released her death grip on the armrests. Her hands were shaking. Her entire body was trembling with the release of tension. Tears streamed down her face, not tears of fear, but tears of accomplishment, of disbelief, of overwhelming emotion. "We did it," Chen whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Emma corrected, her voice thick with tears. "You landed this aircraft." "We did it together," Chen said firmly. He turned to look at the girl sitting beside him, this impossibly young, impossibly brilliant girl who had helped him save 189 lives. "Thank you, Emma. I couldn't have done this without you." Outside the cockpit, the moment of silence lasted only seconds before it transformed into controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles were already rolling toward them, fire trucks with lights flashing, ambulances with paramedics standing ready, airport rescue equipment. They surrounded the aircraft in a coordinated dance that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. The moment the aircraft came to a stop, the doors were opened. Paramedics streamed into the cabin. Thomas, the passenger with medical training, guided them to Captain Morrison's position. They moved with the efficient coordination of people trained in emergency response. An oxygen mask, a gurney, IV lines and cardiac monitoring. Captain Morrison was loaded into an ambulance. The sirens wailed as it raced toward Harborview Medical Center, just 15 minutes away. In the cockpit, Margaret appeared at the door, her eyes wide with the realization of what had just happened. "First Officer Chen," she said, her voice breaking, "you landed this aircraft." And Emma, she looked at the young girl, tears streaming down her own face. "You beautiful, brilliant girl, you saved us all." "Is Captain Morrison going to be okay?" Emma asked urgently. "He's alive," Margaret said. "The paramedics say his vital signs are improving. They're getting him to the hospital. He has a chance because you got him here." In the cabin, 187 passengers erupted in applause. It started as scattered clapping and grew into a roar, the sound of people who'd faced death and been given a second chance. They were crying, laughing, embracing each other. A flight attendant named Sarah appeared with water bottles for the cockpit. "We're going to need to do a passenger statement," she said. "But first, you both need to know that the passengers want to thank you. There's a queue forming." Chen looked at Emma. She looked back at him. They just experienced something that transcended normal human experience. They'd been tested and found themselves worthy. They'd saved lives. "We should probably shut down the engines," Emma said pragmatically, remembering her training. Chen laughed, a real laugh, full of relief and joy and the simple miracle of being alive. He reached for the engine shutdown switches and began the post-landing sequence. Emma assisted, calling out each step with the precision that had characterized their entire coordination. As the engines wound down, the aircraft settled into stillness. The vibration that had been constant since takeoff in Denver became silence. Emma looked out the window. Seattle stretched out before them. The city was beautiful in the afternoon light. The water was visible in the distance. The mountains beyond that. The world looked different now, richer somehow, more vibrant, more precious. She'd studied flying her entire life. She'd logged 800 hours in simulators. She'd read every book about aviation she could find. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for the reality of this moment. She'd helped land an aircraft. She'd saved lives. She'd been tested and had not been found wanting. "Captain Morrison made it to the hospital," Chen said, looking at his phone where a message had come through from Margaret. "Preliminary diagnosis is myocardial infarction, a heart attack, but not catastrophic. They're getting him stabilized. They say his prognosis is good because he got treatment so quickly." Emma felt tears streaming down her face again. Captain Morrison was going to live. The man whose collapse had started this impossible journey was going to survive. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Now," Chen said, "we wait for the investigators, we answer questions, we tell them what happened, and then I suspect we become famous." He turned to look at Emma one more time. "But you know what I think, Emma? I think you were always meant for this. Some people are born to do ordinary things, but you were born to fly. Today, you proved it." In the cabin, paramedics continued their work. Passengers began disembarking, many stopping to look into the cockpit to see the girl and the man who'd saved them. Camera phones came out. Already the story was spreading. The Boeing 737 that had been in crisis was now a symbol of human resilience, of training meeting emergency, of an 11-year-old girl whose passion had prepared her for the impossible. Outside, Seattle waited. The world waited. And in that cockpit, two pilots, one experienced, one barely tall enough to see over the instrument panel, sat in the silence of accomplishment, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. The story broke at 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time on Tuesday afternoon. Within 3 hours, it had become a global phenomenon. News networks interrupted their regular programming. Social media exploded with the hashtag 11-year-old-pilot. Within 6 hours, Emma Richardson's name and face were known to millions of people around the world. The initial investigation by the FAA was conducted with unprecedented scrutiny. Federal Aviation Administration officials had to reconcile a deeply troubling question. How could allowing an untrained child in the cockpit during an emergency possibly be justified? The answer came from examining the flight data recorder and the voice communications that had been captured throughout the emergency. The data was irrefutable. David Chen, without Emma's assistance, would have landed the aircraft safely. He was a trained pilot after all. But that landing would have taken longer. The aircraft's fuel reserves would have been tighter. More critically, Chen's decision-making would have been compromised by the overwhelming stress of flying alone. The data showed that Emma's presence had demonstrably reduced Chen's cognitive load, allowing him to fly with greater precision and confidence. More remarkably, the voice recordings showed Emma catching two critical errors that Chen had missed: a navigation drift that would have delayed their arrival by precious minutes, and a flap configuration that wasn't quite optimal. For an untrained child to spot such errors demonstrated an understanding of aviation that far exceeded what should have been possible. The FAA made a controversial decision. They commended First Officer Chen for his judgment in accepting Emma's help, noting that emergency situations sometimes required creative solutions. They did not prosecute him. Instead, they used Flight 447 as a case study in emergency decision-making and crew resource management. The media narrative, however, was far simpler than the regulatory analysis. 11-year-old girl saves 189 lives. Child prodigy pilots commercial aircraft. The youngest co-pilot in aviation history. Emma became an instant celebrity. News vans surrounded her school. International media outlets requested interviews. Airlines wanted to sponsor her. Flight training companies offered scholarships. Universities that normally required applicants to be 18 years old began making special exceptions for her. The attention was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Her grandfather, Richard Richardson, became her protective shield. He fielded requests, turned down lucrative endorsement deals, and insisted on normalcy where he could find it. "Emma is still a child," he told reporters. "What happened on Flight 447 doesn't change the fact that she needs to be allowed to grow up, to make mistakes, to be 11 years old." But the world couldn't unsee what Emma had done. Captain James Morrison's recovery became the secondary storyline, but it was equally compelling. He woke up 3 days after the emergency, confused but alive. His heart attack had been serious, a 95% blockage in his left anterior descending artery, but the rapid descent to sea level and the swift medical intervention had saved his life. The cardiologists told him that under normal circumstances, he might not have survived. "That girl saved my life," Morrison told reporters from his hospital bed. His voice was weak, his movements careful, but his gratitude was absolute. David Chen was flying the aircraft, but that girl, Emma, she gave him the confidence and the support he needed. Without her, I wouldn't be here. 2 weeks after the emergency, Morrison was well enough to meet with Emma and Chen in a conference room at Harborview Medical Center. Emma walked in nervously, unsure what to say to the man she'd helped save. Morrison stood up. His doctors had cleared him to stand for short periods and pulled her into a hug. "Thank you," he said simply. Emma buried her face in his chest and cried. The aviation industry underwent rapid transformation in the months following Flight 447. Airlines began implementing new protocols for emergency situations involving civilians with specialized knowledge. The FAA developed new training programs for emergency crew coordination. Flight schools started reaching out to young people with aviation passion, establishing mentorship programs and scholarship opportunities. But the most significant impact was cultural. Emma Richardson had shattered a stereotype that had existed for generations. That aviation was a field for adults, that children couldn't contribute meaningfully to technical fields, that expertise was something that only came with age. At her school's assembly 3 weeks after the emergency, Emma stood before the entire student body. The auditorium was packed, not just with students and teachers, but with news cameras, aviation professionals, and government officials. The principal introduced her, and the crowd erupted in applause before she'd even said a word. Emma walked to the microphone, looking impossibly small beneath it. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "A lot of people have asked me what it was like. They want to know if I was scared. They want to know how I knew what to do. They want to know if I'm a superhero or something special. The truth is simpler than that. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I just did what I trained to do. And I'm not special. I'm just someone who loved something so much that I studied it for years. I practiced for hours. I prepared myself for a moment that I never expected to come." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. What happened on Flight 447 wasn't magical. It wasn't impossible. It was preparation meeting opportunity. Any of you could do what I did if you were willing to work for it. If you found something you loved and you studied it and you practiced it and you prepared yourself, you could do extraordinary things too. The applause was deafening. In the months that followed, Emma continued her life as normally as a globally famous 11-year-old could. She returned to school. She continued her flight simulator training, now under the mentorship of Captain Morrison himself. She attended aviation conferences as a speaker. She worked with the FAA on their new emergency protocols. First Officer David Chen was promoted to captain within 6 months, an accelerated timeline that recognized his exceptional handling of the emergency. He and Emma stayed in touch, and eventually, he became one of her official flight training supervisors, the person who would guide her through the process of becoming a real, licensed pilot. Captain James Morrison retired at the end of the year, but not to Arizona golf courses. Instead, he founded a nonprofit organization called Young Aviators Initiative, dedicated to encouraging young people to pursue careers in aviation. Emma became the organization's most visible ambassador. 1 year after Flight 447, Emma stood in the cockpit of a Boeing 737-800, the same model she'd helped land during the emergency. This time, she was there for a commemorative flight, arranged by the airline. As she settled into the co-pilot's seat, now with a proper pilot's uniform custom-tailored for her small frame, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From her bedroom decorated with aviation posters to this cockpit, it had seemed like an impossible dream, but she'd worked for it. She'd studied. She'd prepared. And when the moment came, she'd been ready. Captain Chen, now wearing the 4 stripes of command, smiled at her. "Welcome back, Captain Richardson," he said formally. Emma laughed. Captain Richardson. That would come one day, but not yet. For now, she was still a student, still learning, still preparing. "Thanks for having me back, Captain Chen," she replied. As the engine spooled up and the aircraft began to taxi, Emma looked out at the Seattle skyline visible beyond the cockpit window. Somewhere in that city, people were going about their lives, completely unaware of how close they'd come to tragedy. Somewhere in that city, people would continue to push themselves to do extraordinary things. And in this cockpit, an 11-year-old girl with a passion for flying was beginning her next chapter, the long journey toward becoming exactly what she'd always dreamed of being, a pilot. The sky was waiting, and this time Emma was ready to meet it.